Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm a Californian. I was born in the Bay Area, third generation. So to come back to California, especially when it's freezing rain and snow in Washington, I'm very happy to be here. So when I was first invited to the conference, I said, "Gee, do you really want me? Because I don't have a book or anything to promote." And this was before the series about Versace, the assassination of Johnny Versace, had started to air, and then it took off. And then it started winning all these awards and everything, and Emmys and Golden Globes, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to say that I humbly stand before you as the absolute fantasy of every writer to have had a book that was first published 20 years ago, plucked off the shelf, and made into this award-winning series. I'm very, very grateful to FX and all the wonderful people at Fox, et cetera. So I want to just thank them first for giving my book a brand new life. And then I was going to talk to you a little bit because I've had quite a long, decades-long career, and I belong to the first generation of women writers of news magazines. I was one of the first women writers at Newsweek, and 2019 marks 30 years now that I've written for Vanity Fair, and sometimes it's been hilarious and fun, and other times, to quote the late Hunter Thompson, what a long, strange trip it's been. So today I thought I could skip around the celebrity industrial complex a bit, a term I coined, by the way, to give you some of my own postcards from the edge. But now I notice that I'm not very used to using the clicker, and I forgot to show you all the wonderful slides of, there, we're here. For example, when my son Luke Russert, now 33, was about 5, I had just finished writing about Donald Trump's second wife, Marla Maples. Though they weren't married yet, after all, it hadn't been that long since Ivana had discovered that he was stashing her on their yacht in Atlantic City. And Marla was described in those days as a juicy Georgia peach, very eager to please. And I will never forget the photo shoot on the roof of the Condé Nast building with Marla resplendent in a silver lame one-piece bathing suit and matching 5-inch silver stilettos. And I don't mean to digress, but her publicist, Chuck Jones, was later arrested for stealing Marla's shoes to sniff them. Anyway, Annie Leibovitz was shooting. 4 male stylists were fluffing Marla's hair, touching up her blush and eyes, and Marina Schiano, a super connected Neapolitan by way of Brazil, former intimate friend of Yves Saint Laurent and Andy Warhol, and Vanity Fair's uber fashion stylist was supervising the wind machine to blow this weird black Zorro cape Marla was wearing. And so Annie would call out, "More wind, Marina, more wind." And Marina Schiano would go, "More wind coming." And every once in a while, Marla would giggle with the pure joy of having all this attention displayed on her. And all I could think of was how sad it was that the sports writers, who were some of my best pals at Newsweek, were missing this show because they could have been hanging out their windows just up Madison Avenue. But there were no cell phones then, and I was the only observer. So I finished the piece, rushed home to Washington, and found that my cupboards were bare. So I was wheeling Luke around in the grocery cart in the social Safeway, as they call it, in Georgetown, when a Washington grande dame I hadn't seen in a while said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Oh, I just finished writing about Marla Maples." And then Luke piped up, "I want to wrestle Marla Maples." And I had no idea. And so the Grand Dame didn't miss a beat. She said, "Why, Luke, the last time I spoke to you, you were into Ninja Turtles." and I figured it out later that wrestling Marla Maples must have come from Luke's memory of Lauren Hutton, the original iconic supermodel It Girl, whom I had also written about because she came down to Washington and stayed at our house one night after the piece was published. And the next morning, um, Luke was barely awake when Lauren burst into his bedroom, got down on the floor, and started writhing around to demonstrate how she had wrestled and live alligator for her Vanity Fair shoot. So I think he confused who Mommy was writing about. Washington was then a paragon of control compared to now, but of course, what isn't? And those who took themselves too seriously, mostly men, would ask me what I wrote about for that fashion magazine. And I often quoted my colleague Bob Colacello, who said, "I do in-depth pieces of superficial people." And but my favorite definition came from the mother of one of Luke's schoolmates who was a psychologist. And she came up to me at a parents' meeting and said, "I do so enjoy those case studies of borderline personalities that you write." One of my favorite subjects was the former president of Argentina, Carlos Menem. He had no qualms about getting right down to his skivvies to pose for us on his bed with his little dog. And in my lead, I described him as looking like a lounge lizard from a tango bar in the provinces. And later in Washington, his newly installed press secretary at the Argentinian embassy told me how much the president had enjoyed my story. I was incredulous and politely said, "Thank you." And he said, "Just one question, what means lounge lizard?" And before I could open my mouth, the outgoing press secretary came to my rescue. "It means just like Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca." There it was, that reference to fame or stardom as addicting as opioids. In my second book, The Importance of Being Famous, Behind the Scenes of the Celebrity Industrial Complex, I decried the growing tendency of becoming famous for accomplishing nothing and cited Paris Hilton and her sex tape as an example, because this was pre-Kardashians. How ancient. Now, also, in my book, I used Andrew Cunanan, Versace's killer, as an example of someone who was willing to kill to become famous. Sadly, in this era of mass shootings, this tendency has only intensified. Ironically, I first became aware of Cunanan through seeing a picture of him in black tie in the Sunday New York Daily News, calling him a former social butterfly who had graduated from Bishop School in La Jolla and was wanted for 4 murders. This was 3 months before he killed Versace. He did not sound like the usual serial killer suspect, so I told Vanity Fair editor Graydon Carter that I wanted to try a murder story. I had never reported one before. In the course of my reporting, I had learned that Cunanan had once met Versace at the San Francisco Opera and had become obsessed with him. Although Andrew loved luxury and could discuss anything, he was allergic to working for a living. He possessed a genius IQ and a wide network of acquaintances, but he was also a drug addict and a pathological liar. Versace represented everything Andrew was not, a rich, successful, openly gay fashion icon who could have any boy he wanted. On the day Versace was murdered, the Italian vice consul in Miami didn't even know who Versace was, but the story quickly became the #1 story in the country. The police did not announce a suspect for 12 hours, arguably one of the many blunders law enforcement made in his pursuit. But because police described the suspect as wearing khaki shorts and a white baseball cap, I realized it might be Andrew Cunanan. So Graydon agreed that I should go to Miami just in case. The next morning from National Airport, the Today Show interviewed me, and I broke the news that the two had met before. When I arrived at the Miami airport, there were 14 film crews lined up to interview me. At that point, my original story was already written, fact-checked, and almost on its way to the printers. So I was under tremendous pressure to try to update it and cover what became then the largest failed manhunt in US history. I quickly learned that I knew much more about Andrew Cunanan than the Miami police did. Leads were pouring in from all over the country, but no one could find him. Vanity Fair kept calling to see how fast I could update the story. My agent called and said, "Well, we sold the book." I said, "What book?" And she thought that was a very dumb question. So that's how the book began. Andrew Cunanan eluded capture for 9 days and finally shot himself when a caretaker started to enter the Miami houseboat where he was hiding out. Now, Andrew Cunanan accomplished what I believe he set out to do, become famous or infamous. There are hundreds more details to all 5 of the murders in my book. Now, Michael Jackson, much in the news these days, is another perverse example of fame. He, of course, was one of the most famous people on the planet in 1993 when I got shouted to on the beach in Nantucket to come back to take a call. And that my vacation was suddenly over because Michael Jackson was being accused of molesting a 13-year-old boy. That call became my 12-year odyssey of writing about Jackson 5 times. And of course, for years, I had heard the rumors about Wade Robson and Jimmy Safechuck. For years, I heard that Wade Robson, Safechuck's parents got a new Mercedes from Jackson every year, and Robson's mother testified at his trial that she got a green card by funneling her wages through his corporation. And these are the 2 former constant boy companions of Jackson's who are very much in the news now as the latest accusers in the explosive new documentary that was shown at Sundance last week. So for me, it was highly ironic to read in IndieWire that there were only vague rumors about Jackson's behavior with boys. Oh my gosh, see, this is so bad. I'm sorry. Here we are. Jackson's behavior with boys. Not true if you had read my stories, but back then, these young boys' families always denied it all. Robson even testified under oath at Jackson's molestation trial in 2005 that nothing ever happened between them. I will never forget Robson's anguished father calling me from Australia in 1993 to say he was estranged from his wife and rarely able to see his son because his wife had left 1 child behind with him and took Wade and his sister to live near Michael. He was tortured by the allegations against Michael Jackson because he himself had been molested, he said, and hadn't confessed to anyone in his family for 30 years. He felt threatened that if he said anything against the King of Pop, his wife would never let him see his son again. A week later, he called back to say he had finally gotten through to his wife, and please don't mention our conversation. Instead, he wanted to give me a quote about how great Michael Jackson was. That anguished dad, Dennis Robson, who had been diagnosed as bipolar, committed suicide in 2002. And today, Wade Robson blames Michael Jackson for his father's death. Wade Robson himself has suffered 2 nervous breakdowns. When he first made his U-turn and filed a suit against Jackson's estate in 2014, he referred to FBI records of documents seized during the investigation of former private eye to the stars Anthony Pellicano, who's now in jail, who was charged with 110 felonies on everything from possessing explosives to wiretapping celebrities. One of Pellicano's most important clients was prominent LA attorney Burt Fields, who represented Jackson in the 1993 case. And Pellicano was working for him on Jackson. One record unearthed was a 1993 redacted memo to Anthony Pellicano that stated a $600,000 payment had been made to the mother of another boy a year before the 1993 case via another lawyer. That memo states that Jackson allegedly had already paid off 17 other alleged victims as well. Michael Jackson was not only addicted to drugs, he was so addicted to fame and dependent on attention that he was willing to dangle his infant son over a hotel balcony in Germany to the chanting fans below. And on the day he entered his not guilty plea in the 2005 case, he jumped up on the hood of an SUV to greet fans whose transportation, they told me, had been paid by his people to get them to the courthouse. Now, Wade Robson's father was not the only father of an alleged victim of Michael Jackson who committed suicide. Evan Chandler, the father of Jordy Chandler, the 13-year-old whom Michael Jackson slept with, 33 nights in a row when he was 34 at Geordie's house with his mother's approval, also committed suicide in 2009. Geordie received an $18 million payoff from Michael Jackson, and his parents and lawyers also got millions more. Geordie was able to make a drawing for investigators of markings from the skin disease vitiligo that Jackson had, markings that were on his penis. The drawing was then sealed. After a protracted delay, the Santa Barbara DA was able to photograph Jackson's penis. The photograph and the drawings matched. That case never came to trial. Geordie's side told me that for months they were willing to go through the media circus of a trial, but the DA was reluctant with only one accuser, such a celebrity, and they were still smarting from their defeat in the recent O.J. Simpson trial. The DA, on the other hand, said Geordie lost interest after getting the payoff. When Michael Jackson finally did go to trial in 2005 for allegedly abusing another 13-year-old cancer victim, his skillful lawyer turned the plaintiff's eccentric mother into the defendant, and Michael Jackson went free. I started this reporting 25 years ago, but it is only now with the release of this documentary that the public might be willing to face the decades-old unpleasant facts, and perhaps the next chapter about a beloved musical genius should be about the enablers who have made billions protecting Michael Jackson's image, when we are now 2 decades later only learning about such sordid details of how these boys were made to suffer and still suffer. We should ask ourselves, why are parents so starstruck that they would put their children in this kind of harm's way? My other big sexual abuse celebrity investigation was about the allegations against Woody Allen. He and Jackson shared many similarities in how they were treated in life and in the press. One of the most striking things is that both men were considered geniuses who did not have to answer for their time or their whereabouts. When the allegations broke of Woody's alleged sexual molestation of his adopted daughter, the 7-year-old Dylan, and his affair with her adopted sister, Soon-Yi, his powerful PR machine was able to marshal all the big media then to concentrate on him and his side. Woody not only got the covers of Time and Newsweek, he also got 60 Minutes. The New York Times has always particularly singled Woody Allen out for very special treatment. For example, even in a 2014 profile of Ronan Farrow, Dylan's brother, in the New York Times Magazine, the sexual abuse allegations against Woody, which were a huge factor in breaking up Mia and Woody's relationship, were not even mentioned. Rather, the Times blamed the breakup on Woody's affair with her daughter, Soon-Yi. But I digress. Because so much of the media attention originally had focused on Woody, when I was assigned the story, I decided to take the angle Mia's story as a fresh way to do it. I absolutely had no preconceived notions. I talked to dozens of people close to the family, including their numerous shrinks, all paid for by Woody. Now, one of the things you look for as a reporter is consistency. Do people's stories and impressions jibe? I also interviewed Woody Allen's sister and others from his side. One of the strongest takeaways from that reporting was Allen's total obsession with this little girl, to the point that he basically ignored the other children. In fact, my reporting broke the news that Woody Allen had been in therapy for inappropriate behavior with Dylan for almost 2 years. That fact apparently was overlooked by New York authorities when they changed the rules specifically for Woody Allen and Mia Farrow to adopt Dylan as 2 single parents. Despite an intensive campaign on Allen's part to discredit Mia, the authorities seemed to find her and Dylan credible. I just felt as a reporter that my obligation was to dig deeper, to present as much detail as I could. It's like a puzzle, and then you try to figure out where all the little pieces fit. At one point, the Connecticut State Attorney Frank Mako had asked the Yale New Haven Sex Abuse Clinic to evaluate whether or not Dylan was fit to stand trial, and whether she would be a credible witness. Those 2 things. That was their charge. Instead, Yale New Haven ignored that order and proceeded to pronounce that Dylan was prone to fantasy and Woody Allen did not abuse her. They never interviewed Dylan or Mia or anyone from her household, but the head of the clinic did talk to Woody's legal team beforehand. Alan then called a press conference on the hospital steps to declare his innocence. Obviously, that got very widespread coverage. The Connecticut state attorney then issued a statement saying the only reason he had not indicted Woody Allen was because of, quote, the fragility of the child victim. Allen's lawyers immediately jumped on him for using the word victim, which was ill-advised. Moreover, Allen and his team went on a campaign to discredit Mako that lasted 4 years and tried to have him disbarred. They lost. But Mako went through 4 very stressful years and retired early. Meanwhile, Woody and his supporters continued to use the Yale New Haven report as proof of his innocence, even though it was declared unreliable and was not considered by the judge in the 4 times he ruled against Allen, sometimes in scathing terms, in the custody case fought with Mia, a case that went on for years and got no coverage in the press. To be clear, no psychiatrist, psychologist, or medical doctor at the Yale New Haven Hospital ever talked to Mia or Dylan, and the notes of the social workers and the nurse who did were destroyed. Instead, their boss, a pediatrician who had not examined Dylan or talked to Mia, provided the court a sworn deposition. Today, there are still wide swaths of the public who simply think this was a case of revenge by kooky Mia, who had adopted too many children and felt betrayed. If it were only that simple, the police investigators who interviewed both Dylan and Woody still believe that, still today, that they had a good case. In fact, in 2013, one of the chief police investigators told me from my second story that when a child this young mentions pain with regard to touching her private parts, that is usually a telling sign. Plus, Allen's hair and fingerprints were found in the attic of Mia's Connecticut home where the alleged abuse took place. These are some of the 10 undeniable facts I wrote in February 2014 after backlash from Woody's team. It went viral on the internet. I also had talked to 7 of Dylan's siblings. 90% of that story, however, was about Ronan Farrow's paternity, because Mia told me that Frank Sinatra was possibly his father. The fact that I had secured the first ever interview with Dylan, telling me what the whole ordeal felt like to her and the suffering it entailed, was secondary. After that article was published, I was accused of having a special relationship with Mia, and that my writing and that the fact I wrote about her humanitarian work in Africa was a quid pro quo for an interview with Dylan. I mean, honestly, simply not true. Then, after Woody wrote his own op-ed in the New York Times to answer a piece that Dylan wrote, and he got to have it at twice the length usually permitted, and once again cited the Yale New Haven report, that got the prosecutor going, and he wanted to write his own op-ed, and he was not allowed to, and they said that he could have a very abbreviated correction that would have included a quote from Woody Allen, so he declined. So my experience has been that when a famous, rich, and powerful celebrity with a large public following is accused, the imbalance of power towards the famous is very hard often to overcome. It has only been recently, with the advent of the Me Too movement, that this imbalance is being addressed. When the effects of the alleged abuse of those who bring charges is so heinous and lasts so long, and the backlash against them is so fierce, it is difficult to imagine that people would report these things just to get money or attention. My job is to gather the facts and to try to shed light on things people get away with in secret or in darkness. And sometimes certain powerful figures seem to just burst onto the scene as complete unknowns. So I try to find out, how did they get there? And such was the case with Vladimir Putin. I did the first long profile of him in a national magazine just after he was elected president of Russia in 2000. Though I began the reporting before the election, back then the glory days of magazine journalism where they could send you all over the world and you had months and months and unlimited expenses, those are over. But the point was, when you could do that, you could tell the history of the country at the same time you were telling the history of the person, and so you could tell the reader sort of two histories at once. So the fascinating thing about Putin is that he was almost anonymous then, but he was handpicked by the powerful family of Boris Yeltsin, the previous president, to protect their tainted power. Even then, they had an operation to secretly poll the Russian public to find out what kind of candidate would most appeal. They found the Russian people yearned for someone who conveyed an image of pure nationalism and strength, something Putin is careful to do to this day. So obviously, the Kremlin and the KGB have been interfering in elections, including their own, for a long time. It's hard to overstate just how humiliated Russia felt after the fall of communism, and when the US response, misguided in my view, was a policy called shock therapy, let them figure out the market forces for themselves and create a democracy, two things they had absolutely no history or tradition of. Putin benefited from being in the right place at the right time. As a former KGB officer, he had gained a reputation for steadfast loyalty as chief of staff to Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of his hometown, St. Petersburg. Putin's tight-lipped efficiency gained him the nickname the Gray Cardinal. When the mayor got in trouble for a shady privatization deal and was being interrogated on video by prosecutors, the mayor's tough wife burst in and said, "Anatoly, you have a bad heart." The mayor got it immediately and called for an ambulance, and they put him in the hospital. Putin subsequently made all the arrangements for the mayor to be spirited away from the hospital to Paris by private jet. Yeltsin's people were very impressed. Thus began Putin's meteoric rise, first as head of the KGB, then as prime minister. He gained instant popularity as prime minister by taking full responsibility for waging a very bloody and brutal war on the rebellious Muslim Republic of Chechnya. There were several other powerful candidates for Russian president, however, so a campaign had to be created to make Putin appear to be superior, the white knight, untouched by the faintest hint of corruption. The genius stroke of his propaganda people was to model Putin after a dashing undercover KGB agent in an old Russian movie who embodied patriotic ideals. Here we go again, movie star image, star power. I was able to track down his media architect, the guy who designed the strategy, who said he could not believe how well they had pulled it off. I also read that Putin had been a champion of Sambo in high school and college, a kind of Russian martial art like judo. So I also tracked down his actual surrogate father, his old Sambo coach, in the coach's beat-up old gym in St. Petersburg. And I started to get a down-to-earth bird's-eye view of who Vladimir Putin was growing up. Smaller than many, but highly shrewd, who could throw men twice his weight because of his intelligence and tactical ability. After the article was published, the coach was no longer available to the press. In fact, it would be inconceivable today to have that kind of freedom to report in Russia. The knowledge I gained from reporting Putin and Russian politics helped me when I went a year later, right after 9/11, to the Afghan border to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to report on the relationship between terrorism and drugs. Afghanistan cultivated poppies and was a principal drug route to Russia, Pakistan, Turkey, and points west. The Russians had suffered a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan, and the ill-paid Russian soldiers who still patrolled the borders of Tajikistan, for example, would be the ones to stop the illegal flow. But tons came through anyway, just as they do every day into the US. The truth is, the heroin poppy provides the cash for the arms that keeps the young soldiers of the Taliban supplied and perhaps even addicted. At the front, just as the cocoa leaf funded the 50-year guerrilla insurrection of the FARC in Colombia, something I was very familiar with because I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Colombia. But somehow, Americans can never admit that it's our consumption and that of Europe that fuels this widespread bloodshed and terror. Now, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, 2 years before the fall of communism in Russia, Vladimir Putin, who speaks perfect German, was a 36-year-old middle-leveling KGB agent in Oh, I forgot. I'm doing my slides again all wrong. There we are. We're at the Berlin Wall. Okay. He spoke perfect German, was a 36-year-old middle-leveling KGB agent in East Germany. Angela Merkel, who speaks perfect Russian, was a 35-year-old divorced physicist specializing in quantum chemistry and had never uttered a political opinion in public. The two rose in parallel. I was in Berlin doing her profile for the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2014, and she was at her height. And I found that she was practically single-handedly was keeping Putin at bay for the West through frequent, patient, and long phone conversations with him. I mentioned these three pieces because they show how the information and context built from one story can be a bridge to understanding a more nuanced view of the other. In Merkel's case, she was first made fun of for being awkward and geeky and was bullied by male politicians. But she observed and learned and then became a killer herself. When I was in Berlin, Merkel had two female assistants she relied on to help her run the government. Their nickname by envious males was the girls' camp. I have always enjoyed profiling powerful women, whether in show business or politics, some less than others. But it's particularly fun and interesting to learn how things work in foreign countries because I've found the same truth everywhere. Women just have to be much smarter to be at the top. When I was able to get the first interview with Margaret Thatcher after she was forced from office, my piece made headlines because the Iron Lady told me that after she was given a vote of no confidence, after 11 years as British Prime Minister, she said, "My life was shattered." So, but if we're talking about powerful women, however, I never quite had an assignment like writing the December 2015 National Geographic cover story on the Virgin Mary, the most powerful woman in the world. Oops. There she is. I traveled to sites all over the world where apparitions of the Virgin Mary and miracles were said to have occurred. I went to Egypt because Mary is considered the most powerful and holy woman in the Quran. The Quran has a whole chapter devoted to her, and some Muslim women pray to her too. What happened? Oh, okay. There we go. There, Muslim women pray to her too. I went to Rwanda to speak to a woman who, as a young girl, had been one of 3 recipients of apparitions from the Virgin Mary for years, sometimes in front of thousands, always with prearranged dates and times. Those apparitions predicted the Rwandan genocide in graphic terms 12 years before it happened. I learned just how much investigation goes on and how difficult it is to get the Vatican to acknowledge these extraordinary events. And I learned how similarly, all over the world, people who claim to have communicated with the Virgin Mary describe her as neither black nor white, but extremely beautiful with a particularly compelling voice. And interestingly, she had never mentioned to anyone in particular any particular religion, only that she wanted us to love as much as she loved us. There's just one thing though. The National Geographic is a scientific magazine, and whatever you write, even about something that seemingly defies logic, well, the Geographic wants a scientific explanation. So that was quite an edit, but we got there. One of the reasons, a main reason I think of why I was able to complete these assignments was that I began my first 2 years out of college as a Peace Corps volunteer. And that experience taught me so much about how to adapt and travel and talk to all kinds of people and to listen and to be sensitive to what others said and how they thought. In fact, while I was doing a lot of these very dark stories, what got me through was that, like, right during the Michael Jackson trial in 2005, I was also beginning an educational foundation in Medellin, Colombia, where I had first served as a community development volunteer. Right after graduating from Cal and before I got my master's in journalism at UCLA. Today, the Maureen Orth Foundation is my passion, and Marina is because the people in my barrio and my village didn't know how to pronounce Maureen very well, so they called me Marina. And so with your indulgence, I'm going to end my talk today by showing you a short video of this other part of my life. It's from a talk I gave a few months ago in Maine at the Pop Tech conference. And then if we have a few minutes, I'll answer some questions. Thanks so much. Is he gonna? My story began in the 60s when I became a Peace Corps volunteer. I was sent to a place that I'd never heard of, Medellin, Colombia, where I was working in a very poor barrio on the outskirts of town. One Sunday, this dramatic posse of men came galloping up to my door, leading a horse for me, and we went straight up into the mountains. The isolated community there was desperate for a school, and they asked me to help. And a year later, we had a 2-room school, and the sign said Escuela Maureen Orth. Sadly, in the 80s, Medellin morphed into something terribly bloody and violent because of the drug wars and the political climate. Even though the helicopters were hovering overhead, the bullets were flying, nobody ever touched the school. It was valued by all sides. I thought it was safe enough to go back. In 2004, the Secretary of Education summoned me into his office, and he said, Marina, these kids have no chance to compete in the 21st century unless they know technology, unless they know English. Will you please help us make your school the first public bilingual school? And I said yes, because the greatest lesson I had learned in the Peace Corps, lesson number 1, was when brains or talent or courage or beauty are handed out, there's absolutely no discrimination. What is restricted so horribly is opportunity. I figured, okay, I'll do this. That was really lesson number 2. Optimism is a conscious choice. Yes, we can. Today, the Maureen Orth Foundation works in 21 different schools. We teach STEM, robotics from kindergarten, English and leadership. We have foreign volunteers. We've distributed over 7,000 computers to the children. Last May, at a global competition for robotics, RoboRave, our all-girls team, the Little Engineers, won the gold. Yeah! They beat the boys from Japan, China, the United States, India, and Mexico. So, we also teach dropouts, hardcore dropouts, age 14 to 25, how to make apps, how to design websites to try to give them real possibilities for employment. There's a huge deficit of programmers in Medellin. This has nothing to do with charity. We are creating economic development. We are creating GDP value. We are training the future leaders and the future workforce of Colombia. And we are giving them the skills, I think, necessary so they won't fall prey to authoritarianism on either the right or the left. My greatest joy is really to see these kids' faces light up when they're learning. It's just that sort of beautiful energy that I get to observe that has made me so grateful that I said yes. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Am I ever afraid of revenge from, not the Virgin Mary, but am I ever afraid for revenge? I haven't been struck down yet. From powerful people like Putin and Michael Jackson or those people, and Andrew Cunanan. Well, you know, Andrew Cunanan's favorite magazine was Vanity Fair, and I think he was thrilled out of his mind, you know, that somebody was chronicling him. But and also most of my reporting was all done before he killed Versace. Don't forget. So he was dead by the time I was down in Miami and all that stuff. Although I do think he called my house one night because his friends had told him. But he just, I think he really, in that part. The one group that is especially vigilant are the people who support Michael Jackson, and they are very, very, they send very, very vicious tweets. And oh my God, I see, hi, Larry Feldman is Michael's, was the lawyer who represented Jordy Chandler and got the big settlement from. So he did I tell the story correctly? Okay, good. Anyway, so those people are particularly vigilant, and they send a lot of mean and horrible tweets and stuff. So that image is not going to change without a protracted controversy and long, long fight, I think. Yes. Yes. Well, the thing about Taylor, he's asking me if Taylor Swift, she's such an international star at such a young age. Is there a story there? One thing there, yeah, there is a story there. She's extraordinarily poised and smart, and she also has her father was a financial analyst, I believe, and a stockbroker, and so was her mother. They both come. Usually, when you have, I did the cover stories in Newsweek, for example, about Bob Dylan and Stevie Wonder and Bruce Springsteen. Usually you don't get that kind of superstardom unless you have an equal business person behind you that is equally talented. It's just having talent and drive isn't enough. There has to be all parts of a package. And I think that Taylor Swift had the drive and the smarts, but she also had an excellent business package, managers behind her. Anybody else? Yes. Am I still doing stories? Actually, one thing I'm doing is, yes, I am. And one thing that I'm intrigued by now is that the Colombian entry for Best Foreign Film for the Academy Awards, it didn't win a nomination, but it has the premise that the Peace Corps was responsible for bringing drugs to Colombia, which was a huge surprise to anybody who was ever in the Peace Corps. And it seems to have gained this urban legend. It's been in a novel and it's been in a couple of movies that somehow the gringos who were the Peace Corps were the ones that somehow discovered the drug routes, et cetera. So, I mean, to me, that's ludicrous, but it's like trying to prove a negative. So that's what I've been doing lately, is doing that, a bit of an investigation on that. Yes. No, no, no. Actually, my school, it's wonderful. It started as a two-room school with 35 children. Now, now it goes all the way through high school, and we're graduating kids. And I'm so thrilled because one of our English teachers at the school is actually two of the people, young women working for me in my foundation, are from the school itself, and they're both, they're fluent in English and et cetera. There's such myths surrounding Medellin. Medellin was voted the most dynamic city in the world in 2016. It beat out New York and Tel Aviv, and it is a financial powerhouse. And the big impact right now is the Venezuelan situation, because there's over 1 million refugees pouring in. There are already 1 million in there, and they're pouring in all the time. And I don't know how much more Colombia is going to be. They were very welcoming. I don't know how much more they're going to take, but yes, there's a burgeoning middle class. It's the third largest. It was the largest economy in Latin America, and I really. It's fascinating to me that here's Latin America that shares our time zone and our values and all these things, and so much of the attention of international aid is always directed towards Africa or Asia. And in fact, only 10% of international corporate aid goes to Latin America, and of that 10%, only 3% goes to education. So we got some change to make. Yes? Medellin's population is about 3 million. And it's very interesting because I'm on my way down there, actually right from here. I'm going to Colombia, and I just got an invitation from the mayor's office last week that they're going to blow up Pablo Escobar's old building that he lived in, like the Berlin Wall. They're blowing it up because they're so sick and tired of all the tourism that comes around narcos, and they want to focus it. They want to refocus towards the victims and what the reality is, and not have people make money off of him. Yes. Oh, thank you. Luke, my son Luke Russert, he just started this week to write a book because he spent the last 2 years traveling to over 60 different countries. And so he has, he had never really experienced the globe. And obviously, you see from my background, I thought it was very important to have a global outlook. So that's what he's been doing. And he's taken thousands of pictures. So maybe he'll be here sometime. Thank you. I think it's 0. Oh, I'm so happy to see you.